May 7th, 1945. The President of the United States stands in the Oval Office and gives an order that sounds impossible. I don't want to hear that name in this building, not for a while. Are we clear? His press secretary asks carefully. Which name, Mr. President? Truman's jaw tightens. You know damn well which name. Roosevelt, Franklin, FDR, any of it. I don't want to hear it. For 6 months, White House staffers learned to talk around Franklin Roosevelt's name like he had never existed. But why? What could make a president so angry that he banned his predecessor's name from being spoken? The answer reveals one of the most toxic relationships in presidential history. Welcome to History of World War II, where we uncover the untold stories that shaped our world. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We bring you deep dives into the moments history books skip over. Now, let's dive into the story of two presidents, a devastating betrayal and a 6-month silence that changed American history. The unofficial ban lasted 6 months. From May through October 1945, White House staffers developed a strange skill. Talking around the previous president's name like he was a ghost no one dared summon. They said, the previous administration, or before, or just left awkward silences where Roosevelt's name should have been. New employees were quietly warned by veterans. Don't mention Roosevelt around Truman, unless you want to see a man's face turn purple with rage. Staff members would whisper to each other when Eleanor Roosevelt visited to collect personal items. Mrs. Roosevelt is coming today. Be careful. Not because Eleanor was difficult, but because her very presence made it impossible to avoid mentioning her husband. But here's what makes this story fascinating. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about policy disagreements. This was personal. And the breaking point came on May 6th, the day before victory in Europe. Truman had been president for less than a month. He was drowning. Decisions about ending the war with Japan, managing the alliance with Stalin, trying to understand the Manhattan Project that Roosevelt had hidden from him. 18-hour days, 4 hours of sleep, living on coffee and adrenaline. And everywhere he turned, someone was telling him what Roosevelt would have done. Mr. President, when President Roosevelt handled this situation, Sir, the Roosevelt approach was, FDR always said. That afternoon, Truman sat in a cabinet meeting about post-war Germany. Henry Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, was explaining his plan. Destroy Germany's industrial capacity entirely. Turn it into an agricultural nation that could never threaten Europe again. And Morgenthau kept invoking Roosevelt's ghost. President Roosevelt understood that Germany must be punished severely. President Roosevelt agreed with me that half measures wouldn't work. President Roosevelt wanted, Truman interrupted. President Roosevelt is dead. The room went silent. Morgenthau looked stunned. Truman continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. President Roosevelt has been dead for nearly a month. I am the president now. And I think your plan is insane. It would create 50 million starving Germans who would become easy prey for communist agitation. So no, we're not doing it. Meeting adjourned. He stood and walked out, leaving Morgenthau sitting there, humiliated in front of the entire cabinet. But that confrontation, that was just the surface. What happened later that evening revealed the real depth of Truman's rage. Charlie Ross, Truman's press secretary and childhood friend, came to the Oval Office around 8 p.m. He found Truman sitting in the dark, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Ross turned on a light. Truman looked exhausted, furious. Do you know what I found today, Charlie? In Roosevelt's desk. Do you want to know what that son of a bitch left me? Truman pulled out a folder and threw it across the desk. Ross started reading. It was a memorandum Roosevelt had written in February 1945, 2 months before his death, titled, Concerns Regarding the Vice President. In it, Roosevelt documented his doubts about Truman's capability. He called Truman a small-minded machine politician from Missouri, who lacked the vision required for global leadership. Roosevelt suggested the party should consider replacing Truman on the ticket in 1948, and if Roosevelt died before then, the memo suggested the cabinet should provide extensive guidance and oversight to ensure Truman didn't make catastrophic mistakes. Think about that for a moment. Roosevelt knew he was dying. He knew Truman would likely become president during the most critical period in world history, and instead of preparing him, Roosevelt wrote a memo calling him incompetent. But there was more. Over the past 3 weeks, Truman had been discovering Roosevelt's secrets, correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, where FDR had made commitments about post-war Eastern Europe, commitments far more extensive than what was publicly known. Roosevelt had essentially agreed to Soviet domination of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, in exchange for Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. Truman was now stuck with these secret agreements he had never been consulted about, and fundamentally disagreed with. He found notes showing Roosevelt had told advisors not to brief Truman on sensitive matters because he doesn't need to know yet. The Manhattan Project was just the most dramatic example. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. He had met alone with Roosevelt exactly twice, for a total of maybe 30 minutes. That wasn't accidental. It was intentional isolation. But here's what really destroyed Truman's respect for Roosevelt. Roosevelt had never wanted him as vice president in the first place. The party bosses had forced Truman onto the ticket at the 1944 Democratic Convention because Henry Wallace was considered too left-wing. Roosevelt resented this imposition, and he took out his resentment by freezing Truman out completely. Let me paint you the full picture of Truman's journey. He came from a political machine in Kansas City, run by Tom Pendergast. That gave him a permanent reputation as a hack, a stooge. When he was elected to the Senate in 1934, colleagues dismissed him as Pendergast's errand boy. He worked hard, chaired important committees, built a reputation for integrity and competence, and still, people saw him as a lightweight. When Roosevelt picked him as vice president in 1944, Truman thought it was validation. He thought Roosevelt saw something in him, believed in his capabilities. Now he knew the truth. Roosevelt hadn't picked him at all. The party bosses forced Truman on Roosevelt, and FDR responded by treating him like an unwanted burden. Everything Truman had achieved meant nothing to Roosevelt. He was just the machine politician from Missouri, not worth briefing, not worth trusting, not worth preparing for the possibility that he might actually become president. Ross asked the obvious question that night. Why not just tell people the truth about how Roosevelt treated you? Truman's answer revealed his dilemma. Because I can't. The country needs to believe in Roosevelt right now. The war isn't over. We still have Japan to defeat. The alliance with Britain and the Soviets is fragile. If I start attacking Roosevelt's memory, I look petty. I look like I'm making excuses. The press would destroy me. So Truman made a choice. He would smile in public, pretend to honor Roosevelt's legacy. But in private, in the White House, he created a space where Roosevelt simply didn't exist. The next day was May 7th, Victory in Europe Day. Truman had to give a national address. Millions expected him to praise Roosevelt, to credit him with leading America to victory in Europe. Truman wrote a speech that mentioned Roosevelt exactly once. President Roosevelt did not live to see this day, but we know he shares in our victory. One sentence, that was it. His speechwriters had written extensive tributes to FDR. Truman cut all of it. The press noticed. Newspapers criticized Truman for not showing proper respect. And that's when Truman gave his staff the informal ban. He couldn't publicly attack Roosevelt without destroying himself politically. But he also couldn't stand hearing constant comparisons. So he created his bubble. The ban created bizarre situations. A young State Department aide was briefing Truman on Soviet demands about Poland in June 1945. The aide said, "Mr. President, at Yalta, President Roosevelt agreed to..." Truman cut him off sharply. "I've read the Yalta agreements. Just tell me what the Soviets are demanding now." The aide, flustered, continued, "Well, sir, they're citing President Roosevelt's commitment to..." Truman stood up. "Are you deaf? I said tell me what they want now, not what Roosevelt promised them." The aide left shaken. Word spread fast. Mentioning Roosevelt to Truman was career suicide. In July, Truman attended the Potsdam Conference, meeting with Stalin and Churchill. and later Clement Attlee when Churchill lost the British election. This was Truman's chance to step out of Roosevelt's shadow, and he took a much firmer line with the Soviets than Roosevelt ever had. When Stalin made demands about reparations from Germany and control of Eastern European governments, Truman pushed back hard. Stalin reportedly told his interpreter, "This is not the same as dealing with Roosevelt. This one has a spine." But even at Potsdam, Roosevelt's ghost haunted him. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov kept referencing what Roosevelt had promised at Yalta, insisting Truman had to honor those commitments. Truman's response was blunt. "I didn't make those promises. I'm not bound by private agreements I was never told about. Roosevelt is dead. You're dealing with me now, and I have different views about how cooperative we're going to be with Soviet expansion." The American press covering Potsdam wrote stories about how Truman was abandoning Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation. They portrayed Truman as needlessly antagonistic, as lacking Roosevelt's diplomatic finesse. Truman read these stories and seethed. He was being blamed for not continuing Roosevelt's policy of appeasing Stalin, a policy Truman believed was naive and had already led to Soviet domination of half of Europe. But he couldn't defend himself without attacking Roosevelt publicly, so he absorbed the criticism. August 6, 1945. Truman authorized the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Truman had made the most consequential decision of the 20th century, a decision Roosevelt had set in motion but never had to make himself. And immediately people started asking, would Roosevelt have done it? Would FDR have used the atomic bomb? The speculation drove Truman crazy, because Roosevelt hadn't briefed him on the Manhattan Project, hadn't shared his thinking about how the weapon should be used, had left Truman to make an impossible choice with inadequate preparation. In September, 5 months into the informal ban, Truman had a conversation with his wife Bess. Bess mentioned that someone suggested naming something after Roosevelt, a building, a memorial. Truman's response was cold. "Let them, I don't care. But they're not getting me to dedicate it or speak at it. I'm done pretending I have warm feelings about that man." Bess, who rarely challenged Harry, said, "You can't keep nursing this grudge forever. People will notice." Truman shot back. "Let them notice. I spent 82 days as vice president being treated like I was too stupid to be trusted with information. Now I'm supposed to be grateful for the privilege?" The ban started to lift in October 1945, about 6 months after it began. What changed? Several things. First, Truman had proven himself. He had made tough decisions about the atomic bomb, about Japan's surrender terms, about Soviet aggression. He had established his own identity as president, separate from Roosevelt's shadow. He didn't need to avoid Roosevelt's name anymore because he wasn't being compared to Roosevelt as much. He was being evaluated on his own terms. Second, Truman started to separate his anger at Roosevelt from his understanding of Roosevelt's historical importance. He could acknowledge that Roosevelt had led America through the Depression and World War II, had fundamentally transformed the relationship between government and citizens, had been a genuinely significant president. That didn't mean Truman had to like him or forgive how he'd been treated. But it meant Truman could speak Roosevelt's name without rage clouding his judgment. The first time Truman publicly praised Roosevelt after the ban was at a Democratic Party event in late October 1945. He said, "President Roosevelt built the foundation of victory. We are harvesting what he planted." Hardly effusive praise, but more than the bare minimum he'd been offering for months. His staff noticed. The ban was over. But Truman never forgave Roosevelt. Not really. In private letters and diary entries over the years, Truman remained bitter. In 1947, he wrote to his sister, "Roosevelt was a great president in many ways, but he was also selfish and short-sighted about succession. He left this country and his vice president completely unprepared for what came after him because he couldn't accept his own mortality." In 1952, leaving office, Truman wrote in his diary, "I accomplished things Roosevelt never could have, because I wasn't blinded by my own legend." He thought he was indispensable. I knew I was just a man doing a job. The most revealing moment came in 1960. Truman was giving interviews for a book about his presidency. He was asked directly, "Did you admire President Roosevelt?" Truman paused for a long time, then said, "I admired what he accomplished for the country. I did not admire how he treated people who worked for him. He could be cruel in casual ways, dismissive of people he thought beneath him. I was one of those people. He made that clear. So no, I didn't admire him personally. But I respected what he did for America, even when I disagreed with how he did it." The interviewer asked if Truman thought Roosevelt had deliberately sabotaged him. Truman's response was carefully considered. "I think Roosevelt was in denial about dying. He convinced himself he would recover, would serve out his term, maybe even run again in 1948. So he didn't prepare anyone to take over because he wasn't planning to give up power. That's human nature, but it was also irresponsible. A president has a duty to prepare for succession, especially during wartime. Roosevelt failed that duty, and I paid the price. America paid the price." Years after Truman's death, historians discovered more evidence. Memos showing Roosevelt had instructed his staff to minimize Truman's access to information. Records of cabinet meetings where Roosevelt openly mocked Truman's intelligence and background. Private letters where Roosevelt expressed regret about being forced to accept Truman as his running mate. All of this validated Truman's anger and explained why the ban, which seemed petty or thin-skinned at the time, actually made perfect sense. Truman's presidency vindicated him in the end. He integrated the armed forces, stood up to Soviet expansion, rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, recognized Israel, established NATO. He made mistakes, including firing Douglas MacArthur in a way that damaged his popularity. But by the time he left office in 1953, he had established his own legacy. He was no longer just Roosevelt's successor. He was Harry Truman, the president who made the tough calls Roosevelt had avoided. So here's the question we should ask ourselves. If you were in Truman's position, handed the most powerful office in the world with zero preparation, discovering your predecessor had deliberately sabotaged your ability to succeed, and being constantly told you were not measuring up to a man who had treated you with contempt, what would you do? The 6-month ban on Roosevelt's name wasn't petty. It was survival. Sometimes the most powerful person in the world needs permission to be angry. Truman gave himself that permission in the only way he could without destroying his presidency. He banned a name for 6 months, not because he was small, but because he was human. And sometimes being human means admitting you hate hearing the name of someone who treated you like you didn't matter. The informal ban remains one of the stranger episodes in White House history. Staff members who worked there during those 6 months remembered it decades later as surreal, when everyone knew the rule, but no one quite understood it. Only when the full story emerged about Roosevelt's treatment did it make sense. History remembers Roosevelt as one of America's greatest presidents, and it remembers Truman as the man who proved he didn't need Roosevelt's shadow to make history of his own. But for 6 months in 1945, in the hallways of the White House, one name was forbidden. And that silence spoke louder than any tribute ever could. If this story made you think differently about presidential power and human nature, hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We've got more untold stories from World War II that will change how you see history. To our subscribers who've made it this far, thank you for being part of this community. Your comments and insights make every video better. What do you think? Was Truman justified in banning Roosevelt's name? Or should he have risen above it? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.